Tom Reynolds was not just any electrician. To the people of Crestwood, he was a quiet hero, though most didn't realize it until much later. For 30 years, Tom had been the man behind the scenes, fixing everything from buzzing light bulbs to massive power outages that threatened to plunge entire neighborhoods into darkness. He wasn't flashy or loud, just reliable, dependable, and good at what he did. People trusted him because they knew if Tom said something could be fixed, it would be fixed right. Every morning, Tom woke up before sunrise, brewed himself a strong cup of coffee, and headed out to whatever job awaited him that day. Some days were easy, a quick repair here, a new outlet installed there. Other days were grueling marathons where he worked late into the night, battling storms, faulty wiring, and equipment failures. But no matter how tough the job got, Tom always stayed calm. His steady hands and sharp mind made even the trickiest problems seem manageable. Over the years, Tom became more than just an employee of Crestwood Electric Company. He became its backbone. Newer workers looked up to him as a mentor, while older ones respected his experience and dedication. If you asked anyone in the company who they'd call in an emergency, 9 times out of 10, the answer would be Tom Reynolds. And yet, despite all his contributions, Tom rarely received the recognition he deserved. Sure, bosses patted him on the back occasionally, but when promotions came around, someone else's name was always chosen instead. It wasn't fair, but Tom never complained. He figured that was just how things worked. But over time, the weight of those unspoken sacrifices began to wear on him. The long hours took their toll, leaving him feeling tired and disconnected from the things he used to love. Weekends spent fishing at the lake? Gone. Evenings tinkering with woodworking projects in his garage? Rarely happened anymore. Instead, Tom found himself buried under endless calls about malfunctioning transformers or burnt-out circuits. No matter how hard he tried, there always seemed to be another problem waiting for him. The final straw came one stormy Friday evening. A fierce thunderstorm rolled through Crestwood, knocking out power across half the city. Trees fell onto power lines, sparks flew dangerously close to rooftops, and panicked residents called in nonstop, desperate for help. Tom was already exhausted from a full week of work, but duty called. Alongside his crew, he braved the rain, climbing slippery poles and wading through flooded streets to restore electricity bit by bit. By the time the storm passed and the last streetlight flickered back on, it was nearly midnight. Tom's clothes were soaked, his muscles ached, and his patience was thinner than ever. As he drove home that night, gripping the steering wheel tightly, Tom realized something. He couldn't keep doing this. Not anymore. The constant pressure, the lack of appreciation, the endless grind, it was too much. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. A life where he didn't have to answer every phone call or rush to fix someone else's mess. A life where he could finally focus on himself. The next morning, Tom sat down at his kitchen table and wrote a short but firm letter. "Dear Mr. Harris," it began, addressing his boss. "After 30 years of service, I have decided to retire, effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity to work with such talented individuals over the years." That was it. No dramatic explanation, no list of grievances. Just a simple statement of fact. When Tom handed the letter to his supervisor, the following Monday, the reaction was immediate. Shock rippled through the office like a wave. "Are you serious?" his boss asked, looking genuinely stunned. "We can't afford to lose you, Tom. You're irreplaceable." "I'm sorry," Tom replied softly, meeting his boss's gaze. "But I've given enough. It's time for me to move on." News of Tom's departure spread quickly throughout the company. Co-workers stopped by his desk to express disbelief and gratitude. Some offered heartfelt thanks, while others joked about how nothing would ever run smoothly without him. Despite the outpouring of sentiment, Tom remained resolute. This was his decision, and he wouldn't change his mind. On his last day, Tom packed up his tools one last time, and shook hands with everyone who came to say goodbye. As he walked out of the building carrying his worn toolbox and a small box of personal belongings, he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt free. Free to rediscover hobbies he'd neglected. Free to sleep in on weekends, free to live life on his own terms. Little did he know, however, that Crestwood wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. 2 weeks passed since Tom Reynolds had walked away from his job, and Crestwood seemed to be holding its breath. At first, everything appeared normal, or as normal as it could be without Tom around. The city buzzed along, people going about, their routines, businesses operating as usual, and the streets lit up at night just like they always had. But beneath the surface, cracks were starting to show. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A streetlight near the corner of Maple Avenue started blinking erratically one evening. No one paid much attention at first, after all. Streetlights flickered sometimes. But then another light down the block began behaving strangely, followed by another and another. By the end of the week, entire stretches of roads were plunged into darkness after sunset. Drivers squinted through dimly lit intersections, and pedestrians hurried home, uneasy about the shadows growing longer around them. The problems didn't stop there. Homes and businesses soon reported odd electrical issues. Appliances that had worked perfectly for years suddenly surged with power, frying circuits and leaving families scrambling to replace refrigerators, ovens, and televisions. One morning, a popular diner on Main Street lost power mid-breakfast rush, forcing staff to turn away dozens of hungry customers. Across town, a grocery store's freezers malfunctioned overnight, ruining thousands of dollars worth of food. Complaints poured into City Hall and the utility company, each call more frantic than the last. At first, engineers tried to dismiss the incidents as isolated events caused by aging infrastructure. Crestwood's electrical grid was decades old, patched together over the years with quick fixes and temporary solutions. Everyone knew it was overdue for an upgrade, but funding had always been tight, and politicians preferred spending money on flashier projects. "It's just wear and tear," one official assured reporters during a press conference. "We're working hard to address these issues." But behind closed doors, panic was setting in. Teams of technicians scoured the city, trying to identify the root cause of the chaos. They inspected transformers, checked wiring, and tested equipment, but nothing added up. The failures weren't random. They followed patterns that defied explanation. Some areas experienced repeated outages, while others remained unaffected. Power surges hit certain neighborhoods repeatedly, damaging devices and causing frustration among residents. Engineers scratched their heads, baffled by what they were seeing. Then came the big blow, a catastrophic failure that shook Crestwood to its core. On a Tuesday afternoon during peak business hours, the entire downtown district went dark. Traffic lights blinked out, leaving cars stranded in chaotic intersections. Office buildings emptied as employees spilled onto sidewalks, clutching laptops and phones. Restaurants and shops locked their doors, unable to operate without electricity. The hospital switched to backup generators, but even those struggled under the sudden demand. For hours, the heart of the city lay silent and still, a stark reminder of how fragile modern life could be. As news of the blackout spread, fear rippled through the community. Parents rushed to pick up children from schools, worried about whether buses would run or traffic signals would work. Elderly residents fretted about losing medical devices powered by electricity. Business owners calculated losses, wondering how long they could survive if this kept happening. Social media exploded with complaints, memes mocking the city's crumbling infrastructure and calls for anyone to step up and fix the mess. City officials scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings were called, task forces assembled, and promises made to resolve the crisis. Engineers worked tirelessly, pulling all-nighters in hopes of finding answers. Yet despite their efforts, the problem only grew worse. Every attempt to stabilize the grid seemed to trigger new failures elsewhere. It was as though the city's electrical system had developed a mind of its own, rebelling against every effort to tame it. During one particularly tense meeting, A young engineer named Sarah raised her hand hesitantly. "I know this might sound crazy," she began, glancing nervously at her colleagues. "But maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. This isn't just about fixing wires or replacing parts. It's deeper than that. We need someone who really understands the grid, someone who knows it inside and out." Her supervisor frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm talking about Tom Reynolds," Sarah said quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone knew the name, of course. Even newcomers to the utility company had heard stories about Tom, the man who could diagnose a problem in seconds and fix it faster than anyone else. He'd been the go-to guy for decades, the one everyone relied on when things got tough. And now he was gone. He quit. Someone muttered finally. "There's no way he'd come back." "Maybe not," Sarah admitted. "But if anyone can figure this out, it's him. Don't we owe it to the city to at least try?" Reluctantly, the idea gained traction. Someone dug up Tom's contact information, and a team was dispatched to track him down. Meanwhile, the mayor herself took to the podium to address the public, vowing to do whatever it took to restore order. "We will get through this," she declared, though her voice wavered slightly. "Crestwood is strong, and we will find a solution." Behind the scenes, however, desperation mounted. Technicians whispered about worst-case scenarios, months-long outages, evacuations, lawsuits from angry citizens. The city's economy teetered on the brink of collapse, and morale plummeted. All eyes turned to one man, Tom Reynolds. And so, 2 weeks after walking away from a career that had consumed 30 years of his life, Tom found himself thrust back into the spotlight. Not because he wanted to be, but because Crestwood needed him. Whether he liked it or not, the fate of the city rested in his hands once again. Tom Reynolds had spent the past 2 weeks enjoying a life he hadn't experienced in decades. His mornings began with the soft glow of sunrise instead of the blaring ring of an alarm clock. He would sit on his porch, sipping coffee and watching birds flit between trees. Afternoons were reserved for hobbies he'd long neglected, woodworking in his garage or tinkering with old tools he'd collected over the years. Evenings were peaceful, filled with quiet dinners and the occasional book he'd been meaning to read but never had the time for. For the first time in years, Tom felt like himself again. Gone was the constant weight of responsibility, the endless emergencies demanding his attention. He wasn't thinking about transformers, circuits, or power grids. Instead, he thought about fishing trips he wanted to take, projects he wanted to finish, and places he might visit if he ever got around to traveling. Life felt simple, predictable, and good. That all changed one evening when there was a knock at his door. At first, Tom didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a neighbor borrowing something or a delivery driver dropping off a package. But when he opened the door, he found a man in a suit standing on his porch, looking more nervous than any visitor should. It was Mr. Harris, his former boss from Crestwood Electric Company. "Tom," Mr. Harris said breathlessly, "we need to talk." Tom frowned, stepping aside to let him in. As they sat down in the living room, Mr. Harris launched into an explanation that painted a dire picture of the city's current state. Streetlights blinking out, homes losing power, businesses shutting down. It was chaos, and no one could figure out why. Engineers were stumped, resources were stretched thin, and public frustration was boiling over. The mayor herself had called an emergency meeting earlier that day, pleading for solutions. "And then someone mentioned your name," Mr. Harris admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "They said you're the only one who knows the grid well enough to fix this." Tom listened silently, his expression unreadable. When Mr. Harris finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You want me to come back?" "It's not just me," Mr. Harris replied quickly. "It's everyone, the engineers, the city officials, the mayor. We've tried everything, Tom. Nothing works. Without you, I don't know what we're going to do." Tom stared at him for a moment, then shook his head firmly. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I walked away from that job for a reason. You don't understand how hard it was for me to leave, but I did it because I needed to. I gave 30 years of my life to that company, and what did I get in return? Burnout, and no appreciation. Now I'm finally happy, and I'm not giving that up. Mr. Harris looked crestfallen but didn't argue. He knew Tom well enough to realize that once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. After a few moments of awkward silence, he stood up, thanked Tom for his time, and left. But the conversation lingered in Tom's mind long after Mr. Harris was gone. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of a city falling apart. He imagined families huddled in the dark, businesses struggling to stay afloat, and emergency services stretched to their limits. He thought about the diner owner whose livelihood depended on reliable electricity, and the elderly woman who relied on her oxygen machine to breathe. These weren't faceless strangers. They were people he'd known, people he'd helped before, without hesitation. Still, Tom reminded himself that it wasn't his problem anymore. He'd done his part. Why should he be the one to step in and clean up the mess others had created? The next morning brought another unexpected visitor, a young engineer named Sarah. She introduced herself nervously, explaining that she worked for Crestwood Electric and had been part of the team trying to solve the crisis. Unlike Mr. Harris, Sarah didn't beg or plead. Instead, she spoke passionately about the challenges they faced and the impact the outages were having on the community. "We've tried everything we know," she said honestly, "but none of us understand the system the way you do. You built parts of it, maintained it, fixed it when no one else could. If anyone can figure this out, it's you." Tom listened patiently, impressed by her determination but still unwilling to commit. "Look," he said gently, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm retired now. I've earned this time for myself." Sarah nodded, understanding his position. Before leaving, she handed him a folder containing reports, data, and photos documenting the extent of the damage. "Just look through this," she urged. "See for yourself what's happening, then decide." After she left, Tom placed the folder on his kitchen table and tried to ignore it. But curiosity eventually got the better of him. Flipping it open, he began reading. Page after page detailed the growing catastrophe. Entire neighborhoods without power, hospitals relying on generators, schools forced to close. The final photo stopped him cold. It showed a group of children sitting outside a library using flashlights to read books because the building had no electricity. Tom closed the folder, feeling conflicted. On one hand, he owed Crestwood nothing. They'd taken advantage of his skills for years without truly valuing him. On the other hand, he couldn't deny the pull of responsibility. Deep down, he still cared about the city and its people. He always had. That evening, as he sat in his garage working on a wooden birdhouse, Tom wrestled with his decision. Part 2 of him wanted to stay out of it, to let the city learn its lesson about neglecting infrastructure and undervaluing workers like him. But another part of him, the part that had answered countless calls in the middle of the night, climbed icy poles during storms, and spent hours troubleshooting impossible problems, couldn't turn away. Finally, late that night, Tom came to a conclusion. He wouldn't go back to the job he hated, but he couldn't stand by while Crestwood fell apart either. There had to be a way to help without sacrificing his peace of mind. The next morning, Tom picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. When she answered, he said simply, "Tell me what I need to do." Relief flooded her voice. "Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much." As he hung up, Tom felt a mix of emotions: dread, determination, and a flicker of excitement. For better or worse, he was stepping back into the world he thought he'd left behind. The next morning, Tom Reynolds woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. But Tom didn't have time to appreciate it. His mind was already racing with thoughts about Crestwood's electrical crisis. He had agreed to help, but now that he'd made the decision, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. Could he really fix something so massive and complicated? Would the city even listen to him this time? Dressed in his old work clothes, sturdy boots, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt, Tom packed his toolbox, grabbed the folder Sarah had given him, and headed out the door. As he drove toward the utility company headquarters, memories flooded back. Long nights spent repairing broken transformers, arguments with stubborn bosses, and the countless times he'd been called a miracle worker, only to be forgotten the next day. This wasn't going to be easy, but if anyone could untangle the mess, it was him. When Tom arrived, the parking lot was buzzing with activity. Trucks loaded with equipment lined the curb, and workers hurried in and out of the building, their faces tense with urgency. Inside, the atmosphere was no less chaotic. Engineers huddled around laptops, poring over data and diagrams. Phones rang non-stop as frantic residents reported new issues. Someone handed Tom a cup of coffee and pointed him toward a conference room where Sarah and several other key figures were waiting. As Tom walked in, the room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of hope and disbelief. For a moment, Tom felt like an outsider, an old relic called in to clean up a disaster he hadn't caused. But then Sarah stood up, breaking the tension with a warm smile. "Tom, thank you for coming," she said sincerely. "We're all counting on you." Tom nodded, taking a seat at the table. Without wasting time, Sarah launched into an update. She explained how the situation had worsened overnight. More neighborhoods had lost power, hospitals were struggling to keep backup generators running, and local businesses were threatening lawsuits. Engineers had tried rerouting electricity through different parts of the grid, but every attempt seemed to trigger new failures elsewhere. It was as though the system itself was fighting back. "Do we have any idea what's causing this?" Tom asked, leaning forward. Sarah hesitated before answering. "We've ruled out weather damage and human error. There's something deeper going on, some kind of anomaly in the grid that none of us can explain." Tom frowned. Anomalies weren't uncommon in aging systems, but they usually followed predictable patterns. If this one defied logic, it meant someone or something had tampered with the infrastructure in ways no one understood. That realization sent a chill down his spine. "Show me everything you've got," Tom said firmly. "Maps, schematics, maintenance logs. I want to see it all." For the next several hours, Tom immersed himself in the details. He studied blueprints of the city's electrical grid, traced the flow of power from substations to individual neighborhoods, and reviewed decades' worth of repair records. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. What looked like random failures was actually part of a larger pattern, a cascading series of malfunctions originating from a single source deep within the system. "It's the old transformer, stationed near Riverside Park," Tom announced finally, tapping a spot on the map. "It's been there since the 1970s and no one's touched it in years. I think it's failing, and when it does, it's throwing off the entire grid." The room erupted into murmurs. No one had thought to check that station because it was so outdated that most people assumed it had been decommissioned long ago. Even Tom had nearly forgotten about it. It had been buried under layers of newer infrastructure, quietly humming along in the background while everyone focused on flashier upgrades. "We need to replace it," Tom continued. "But first we need to reroute power away from it to prevent further damage. If we don't act fast, the whole system could collapse." His words struck fear into the group, but they also galvanized them into action. Within minutes, teams were mobilized to carry out Tom's plan. Engineers worked tirelessly to adjust circuits and redirect electricity, while linemen prepared trucks and equipment for the dangerous task of replacing the faulty transformer. Tom coordinated everything, barking orders and offering guidance whenever needed. Despite his reluctance to return to this world, he slipped back into his role effortlessly, commanding respect and trust from everyone involved. As the day wore on, Tom barely had time to eat or rest. He moved between job sites, checking progress, and troubleshooting problems as they arose. At one point, he climbed an icy utility pole himself, refusing to let younger workers take the risk despite their protests. "I've done this 1,000 times," he told them. "Let me handle it." By late afternoon, the first phase of the operation was complete. Power had been successfully diverted away from the failing transformer, stabilizing the grid temporarily. Exhausted but relieved, the team gathered back at headquarters to regroup. Tom collapsed into a chair, rubbing his temples as Sarah handed him another cup of coffee. "You're amazing, Tom," she said, her voice filled in awe. "No one else could have figured this out." Tom shrugged modestly. "I just know how this system works. Anyone else could have done the same if they'd taken the time to understand it." But Sarah shook her head. "No, not anyone. You're the reason we're still standing right now. And we're not done yet. We still have to replace that transformer." Tom nodded grimly. Replacing the old transformer would be the hardest part of the mission. It required shutting down a major section of the grid, which meant cutting power to thousands of homes and businesses temporarily. The mayor had already issued a public statement warning residents about the planned outage, but tensions were high. People were scared, frustrated, and losing patience. One wrong move, and the entire effort could unravel. That evening, as Tom drove home for a few hours of much-needed sleep, he reflected on the day's events. He hadn't wanted to get involved again. Yet here he was, leading the charge to save Crestwood once more. It wasn't fair, and it certainly wasn't easy. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't trade this feeling for anything. For the first time in years, he felt truly valued, not just as a worker, but as a person who mattered. The next morning, Tom returned to find the city holding its breath. The final phase of the operation was about to begin, and everyone was counting on him to see it through. As he suited up and joined the team heading to Riverside Park, he reminded himself why he was doing this. Not for recognition or gratitude, but because it was the right thing to do. Crestwood may have failed him in the past, but today, he was determined to give it a second chance. The morning air was crisp as Tom Reynolds and his team gathered near Riverside Park, where the old transformer station stood hidden beneath layers of rust and neglect. It was an unassuming structure, tucked away behind overgrown bushes and surrounded by weeds. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like nothing more than a forgotten relic of the past. But to Tom, it was the heart of Crestwood's electrical crisis, and the key to saving the city. As workers unloaded equipment from trucks and set up barriers around the site, Tom took a moment to study the transformer. Its metal casing was corroded, its wiring brittle with age. A faint hum emanated from inside, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. This machine had been running nonstop for nearly 50 years, far beyond its intended lifespan. No wonder it was failing. It was a miracle it had lasted this long. "All right, listen up," Tom called out, gathering the team around him. "This is going to be tricky. We're dealing with live wires, outdated components, and a system that's already on the brink of collapse. One wrong move and we could make things worse. So let's stay focused and follow the plan." The plan was simple in theory, but daunting in execution. First, they would shut down the transformer completely, cutting off power to a large section of the city temporarily. Then they'd carefully disconnect it from the grid, remove it piece by piece, and replace it with a modern unit capable of handling Crestwood's current demands. The entire process would take hours. Hours during which thousands of residents would be without electricity. Tom knew patience would be thin, but there was no other way. With a deep breath, Tom gave the signal to begin. Engineers initiated the shutdown sequence, slowly reducing the flow of electricity until the humming stopped altogether. For a brief moment, silence fell over the park, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding across the city. Without warning, streetlights went dark, homes lost power, and businesses closed their doors once again. Social media buzzed with complaints, and phone lines at City Hall lit up with angry calls. But Tom blocked it all out. He couldn't afford distractions, not now. Wearing thick gloves and protective gear, Tom approached the transformer with caution. Every step mattered. Every movement had to be precise. Using a wrench, he loosened bolts encrusted with decades of grime. Sparks flew occasionally, forcing him to pause and assess the situation before continuing. Sweat dripped down his forehead, despite the cool morning air, and his muscles ached from the physical strain. Yet he pressed on, driven by determination and years of experience. Behind him, the team worked seamlessly, following his instructions without question. They handed him tools, held flashlights, and double-checked connections to ensure everything was secure. Even Sarah, the young engineer who had first reached out to him, pitched in, her enthusiasm infectious. Watching them, Tom felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. These were good people, dedicated to fixing what was broken. Maybe Crestwood wasn't beyond saving after all. As the hours ticked by, progress became visible. Piece by piece, the old transformer was dismantled and hauled away. In its place, a sleek new unit was installed, gleaming under the pale sunlight. Wires were reconnected, circuits tested, and safety protocols followed to the letter. By early afternoon, the hardest part was over, but the real test lay ahead. "We're ready to bring it back online," Tom announced, stepping back to survey the setup. His voice carried authority, commanding attention from everyone present. "Let's do this slowly. If anything feels off, stop immediately." One of the engineers nodded and flipped the switch. At first, nothing happened. Then, a low hum filled the air as electricity surged through the new transformer. Lights flickered briefly before stabilizing, and monitors displayed steady readings. Cheers erupted from the team as realization dawned. It was working. Power was flowing smoothly, and the grid was holding strong. But Tom didn't celebrate just yet. He knew better than to assume victory too soon. Instead, he walked around the station, inspecting every connection, listening for unusual sounds, and checking for signs of stress. Only when he was satisfied did he finally allow himself a small smile. "Good job, everyone," he said quietly, clapping a few workers on the shoulder. "We did it." Word of their success spread quickly. Within minutes, social media posts shifted from outrage to relief as lights turned back on and appliances roared to life. Residents cheered from their windows, honked car horns in celebration, and flooded local news outlets with messages of gratitude. Businesses reopened their doors, and hospitals reported stable conditions thanks to restored power. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief. Back at headquarters, the mayor herself awaited Tom's return. When he arrived, she greeted him, with tears in her eyes. "Tom," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you. You've saved us all." Tom shook his head modestly. "It wasn't just me. Everyone here worked hard to make this happen." The mayor insisted on hosting a ceremony to honor Tom and his team, but he declined most of the fanfare. Public recognition wasn't what motivated him. It never had been. What mattered most was knowing he'd made a difference when it counted. That evening, as Tom drove home, he reflected on the day's events. He was exhausted, sore, and emotionally drained, but also strangely fulfilled. For so many years, he had felt invisible, taken for granted by a city that relied on him, but rarely acknowledged his efforts. Now he had proven his worth, not just to others, but to himself. Still, Tom knew this wouldn't last forever. Crestwood's electrical grid was still aging, and unless proper investments were made, similar crises could arise in the future. As he pulled into his driveway, he resolved to stay involved. Not as a full-time worker, but as a consultant. Someone needed to advocate for better infrastructure, fair treatment of workers, and sustainable solutions. And if anyone could convince the city to change, it was him. For now, though, Tom allowed himself to relax. He stepped inside, kicked off his boots, and sank into his favorite chair. Outside, the world buzzed with renewed energy, brightly lit streets reflecting the hope of a city brought back from the brink. Inside, Tom smiled softly, content in the knowledge that he had done what he set out to do. Save Crestwood, one wire at a time. The days following the successful replacement of the transformer were a whirlwind of activity for Tom Reynolds, though not in the way he might have dreaded. Instead of retreating back into solitude, he found himself at the center of an unexpected spotlight. News of his role in saving Crestwood spread like wildfire, and suddenly, people who had barely noticed him before were eager to shake his hand, thank him, or simply hear his story. It was overwhelming, but also humbling. The mayor's office organized a ceremony to honor Tom and the team that had worked tirelessly to restore power to the city. Held in the town square under strings of newly lit lights, the event drew hundreds of residents. Families brought their children, business owners held signs thanking Tom, and local news crews set up cameras to capture every moment. As Tom stood on a small stage alongside Sarah, the mayor, and other key figures, he felt both proud and slightly uncomfortable. Public attention wasn't something he craved, but it was clear how much this meant to the community. When the mayor took the microphone, her voice rang out strong and sincere. "Today, we celebrate more than just the return of our electricity," she began. "We celebrate the man who reminded us what true dedication looks like. Tom Reynolds, you've given 30 years of your life to this city, years filled with hard work, sacrifice, and countless acts of kindness most of us never even knew about. And when we needed you most, you stepped up again. For that, we are forever grateful." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly as the mayor presented Tom with a framed key to the city. Though touched by the gesture, Tom couldn't help but feel a pang of irony. After decades of being overlooked, he was now receiving recognition, but not for the daily grind that had defined his career. Still, he accepted the award graciously, offering a few heartfelt words when it was his turn to speak. "I didn't do this for awards or speeches," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, for my neighbors, for my friends, and for the place I call home. But let me be clear, this isn't just about me. It's about all of us working together to make things better. If there's one lesson I hope everyone takes away from this, it's that we can't wait until a crisis hits to take care of what matters. We need to invest in our infrastructure, support our workers, and plan for the future, not just react to problems after they happen." His words struck a chord with the audience, earning another round of applause. Many nodded in agreement, realizing that Tom's message extended far beyond electrical grids. He was talking about responsibility, foresight, and unity. Qualities the city desperately needed if it hoped to thrive. In the weeks that followed, Tom became a trusted advisor to the city council and utility company. Though he declined offers to return to full-time work, he agreed to serve as a consultant, helping draft plans for modernizing Cresthome's aging infrastructure. His insights proved invaluable, guiding decisions about where to allocate resources, how to prioritize upgrades, and how to create safer working conditions for employees. For the first time in years, Tom felt respected, not just as a skilled laborer, but as someone whose opinions mattered. He also used his newfound influence to advocate for workers' rights. During meetings with city officials, he spoke candidly about the challenges faced by technicians and engineers: long hours, low pay, lack of appreciation, and inadequate training. "These are the people keeping the lights on," he reminded them. "If you want to prevent another disaster, start by treating them fairly." To his surprise, his pleas were met with action. Wages were increased, safety protocols were strengthened, and programs were introduced to mentor young workers entering the field. Despite these accomplishments, Tom remained grounded. He continued to spend his mornings fishing at the lake and his afternoons tinkering in his garage. The difference now was that he no longer felt weighed down by bitterness or regret. Helping Crestwood had reignited a sense of purpose within him, reminding him of why he'd chosen this line of work in the first place. Yes, it had been tough, but it had also been rewarding in ways he hadn't fully appreciated until now. One crisp autumn morning, as Tom sat on his porch sipping coffee, he reflected on everything that had happened. The city was thriving again, its streets illuminated brightly at night and its businesses humming with activity during the day. Residents walked with confidence, knowing their power supply was stable. Even the old transformer station near Riverside Park had been transformed into a symbol of resilience, its shiny new equipment standing as a testament to what could be achieved when people came together. Tom smiled to himself, feeling a quiet pride. He had saved Crestwood, not because he owed it to them, but because he cared. And while he knew challenges would inevitably arise in the future, he believed the city was stronger and wiser for having faced this one head-on. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over his yard, Tom picked up his fishing rod and headed toward the lake. Life was good again, balanced between the peace he cherished and the impact he still wanted to make. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly content. A hero not because he sought glory, but because he chose to step forward when it mattered most.